The Ink Block project's only one development changing the face of Boston and the flow of population. Over the past few decades, the population has been rising, especially in areas near downtown Boston. There's also a smaller percentage of the population in outlying areas. If you're a candidate looking for votes, the changes are even more dramatic. That's the finding of some research published this week by Mass Inc. in Commonwealth magazine. Our guest is one of the two main researchers. Along with having been a city councilor, he's currently an attorney with Nixon Peabody and the author of a new book on Boston politics. And we'd like to welcome Lawrence DiCara. Thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be here, Chris.
Start with your own connection to the Ink Block district.
My dad worked at the Boston Herald, and when the Herald moved there in the late 50s, I remember going to the open house they had on Sundays. And they had a big open house for all the employees and their families. I put on my tie, and may have been my first communion suit for all I know. And Daddy brought us through and showed us where he worked. And there was an enormous escalator leading from the first floor to the second. And that was the first time I'd ever seen an escalator except at Jordan Marsh. And at Jordan Marsh, the escalator led to the Enchanted Village. So we always thought positively of it. So my dad was in that building till the Hearsts bought the Herald in 1972.
Well, of course, what's also going now is sort of a reversal of the 50s and early 60s. We got rid of New York streets, we got rid of the West End, and now we have all these residential areas springing up.
Those two precincts, the West End and the area around New York streets, Ward 3 Precinct 5, Ward 3 Precinct 7, are two of the most rapidly growing precincts in the city, because where nobody was living, lots of people are living, and those precincts were among the top 8 precincts in the presidential election last November.
And of course, you've got other areas where there wasn't even residential housing before: Charlestown Navy Yard, Fort Point Innovation District in South Boston. So I guess we've got a pattern here.
The pattern is very, very clear. Just as population had moved south for a period of 50 or 60 years, now it's moving back towards the northern part of the city. And what's the most interesting is the immediate downtown area, which really hasn't had any housing for a long time. And those two downtown precincts, going from more or less the Congress Street garage that goes over the street, that big hulk of a garage, again a late 60s, early 70s building, all the way into Chinatown. Those two precincts have 15,000 people, with another 2,500 units being constructed right now. There will be more people living in downtown per se than in Charlestown in a couple of years.
Of course, what's also going on is change in some of the outlying areas. I'm thinking especially of areas that are known for political clout. West Roxbury, it's not as if there are fewer housing units, but the population has changed.
The number of large families, large Irish Catholic families in West Roxbury has diminished significantly. The same is true for the coastal sections of Dorchester, Hyde Park, Rosendale, even South Boston has far more adults, far fewer children, and far more people who were born someplace else. Those folks have no political history. They don't know a Hennigan from a Finnegan, and many of them have no real ties to the city.
Of course, if you look at other areas, South Boston, you have one end where the population is going up, and another end where, at least in terms of people who can vote, I guess it's going down. In
the sections of South Boston which are close to Andrews Square, there are two major housing projects, large numbers of immigrants, and that population, in terms of voting percentage of the city, has gone down precipitously. In the northern ward, Ward 6, which includes Channel Center, Fort Point, all those neighborhoods, it's gone up because people have filled in all those empty spaces.
East Boston still have spaces and people, but again, a lot of immigrants who might not yet be eligible to vote.
Census tells us that East Boston is more than 50% Hispanic. The Hispanics in East Boston are, for the most part, South Americans. They are not Puerto Ricans who are automatically citizens. That's why the percentage of the vote in East Boston is a bit more than half it was 30 years ago. East Boston does not have the clout that it did when Kevin White was mayor.
You know, you've also, in the Mass Inc. article, you looked at the kinds of elections that bring people out. And this year we're coming into a city election, so I guess it's going to be different from what we might have even experienced in recent years.
In the presidential elections, almost 100,000 people vote who do not vote otherwise. Almost 100,000. And that's an enormous number of people. Most of them are young, they're educated, many of them are single. They've lived here for shorter periods of time. If any one of the candidates, announced or unannounced, could wake up that sleeping giant, they'll be in the final election. But traditionally, those folks do not vote for mayor. They only vote for president.
And what about even this year? Because this is a strange year. We have all of these special elections. We have a U.S. Senate special election that's coinciding with a state Senate. And so could we see some mixing, at least, maybe some more people?
There might be. The Scott Brown-Martha Coakley election brought out 40,000 more people than voted for mayor a few weeks earlier. So it's possible the Senate election could get folks out to vote. But let's just assume you're from Iowa and you're living in a loft in Fort Point. The likelihood of you knowing who your state senator is, or regretfully caring who your state senator is slim. On the other hand, you may be really concerned about who sits in the U.S. Senate, because that's going to affect you if you go back to Iowa, move to New York, California, whatever. The demographics are dramatically different. And I expect there'll be a higher turnout in this city election year because of the open mayoral seat, the first real one since 1983, and also because we'll have so many vacancies on the city council.
What I also saw in your report and have seen confirmed elsewhere is that in predominantly black neighborhoods in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, either more people are signed up to vote or they're motivated to come out and vote as well.
There's much higher turnouts in the presidential election, I expect driven by the Obama candidacy. The major variable, which is tough to determine from the census, is that in many neighborhoods of color, a high number of the people are children and therefore not eligible to vote, because the goodly number of the children in the city are minority children, not white children today. And also so many are not citizens. Ward 15 in Dorchester, Meeting House Hill, which was a political breadbasket of votes 50, 60 years ago, is now nearly completely immigrant people, many of them not citizens. Therefore, the voting percentages in that ward are down significantly. If when you and I were growing up in Dorchester and Mattapan, Chris, somebody had told us there'd be 15, 20,000 Vietnamese living in Dorchester, nobody would have believed us. Right. And yet they're an important part of the community.
And Ward 16 isn't the powerhouse it used to be
Ward
either.
16 has large numbers of immigrant people, especially more inland, Fields Corner, Clam Point, Precinct 2 is full of yuppies. The hardcore of Ward 16 is much smaller, much less clout than a generation ago.
What about the makeup here? Because even unlike the time you ran for mayor 30 years ago, there were so many people taking the plunge. This looks like it's anyone's guess.
It is anyone's guess. Once Kevin White dropped out, and he dropped out in May, the Thursday of Memorial Day weekend, everybody assumed Finnegan was the front runner. Finnegan had taken him on early, had taken him on in '79, had lined up support from some of the people who supported Joe Timilty in the '70s, and most people assumed that Finnegan would be in the final. He wasn't. The city had changed as we were sitting there campaigning, and David came in third. Right now, there is no front runner.
30 years ago, I saw you on the beach in South Boston looking for. Are we going to see more of that from these people?
I think these folks will be out getting votes one by one. That's the way you get elected to office. There's not enough time to raise that much money to go up on TV. I think it'll be a very personal campaign, and that's very healthy for Boston.